We are fortunate enough today to have one of my fantastic mentors with us, Murray McInnis. Murray was formerly of the bench of the Federal Court and has spent many years in an amazing career as a barrister. Murray also has a fantastic application and understanding of the law in real practical terms, and there's some of the reasons why I really appreciate the mentoring and also the relationship that I share with Murray. I've got some questions that I'd love to share with Murray. I'd also love to, at this moment, take this time to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're in today. We're at the Law Institute of Victoria here in Melbourne, the home and land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I would love to acknowledge the elders, past, present and future. Murray, thank you so much for being with us today.
Good.
Yeah. And Murray, I was just wondering, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and also how you started in your legal career?
Well, I started as an article clerk, like everybody, at Brian Ward and Partners. I became Ant Partners, but it was Brian Ward at that stage, a solicitor. Did that for a few years. Then in 1980 went to the bar. In the year 2000 was appointed as a federal magistrate of what's now the Federal Circuit Court. And then left that after about 8 years, came back to the bar. So I've been in the bar almost 40 years.
That's fantastic. So it was 20 years of experience before going
Before
to the
that,
bar.
that's right. Well, 20 years experience as a barrister before being appointed, but a few years as a solicitor before going to the bar.
That's terrific. And when you at your time at the bar, what can you share with us one of the really memorable and enjoyable moments you experienced?
Well, look, I think there are lots of memorable times, and a lot of the work I did was criminal law, and that has its own dynamic, but a lot of the other work was civil work, and there were some interesting cases earlier on involving football players, that sort of thing, and restraint of trade. They were very popular in the 80s, and then the rules of the AFL changed, but there were players in the West, Narkle and Cronin were a couple of names I remember. There was a big case, went for about just over a week here in Victoria, and the whole notion then was to try and not treat players as if they were cattle, and to try and encourage the football teams and the organisation, the league, to treat them with respect. Yeah. And I think that's terribly important.
Yes.
And although at the moment there's a draft and, obviously people haggle, but in those days there was no haggling. They just decided to move a player interstate or whatever without the player's consent at all. And it was just a question of shoving them around.
Yes.
And we thought that was bad. And the rules have changed.
And was that before the establishment of the AFL Tribunal?
Yes. It was then called the VFL, and it became the AFL, and then we had an AFL Tribunal, but that was later on. So originally it was Victorian Football League, then it became the Australian Football League, and they realised they had to be Australia-wide to include teams from interstate and make it an Australian football culture. And that's terribly, terribly important. And then, as you know, there are footballers come from all around Australia and they play for various teams, and that's great.
Yes. Yeah. And I think it sounds like you had some true experiences in sports law before it became really fashionable.
Yes, it wasn't as trendy then as it is now, but I think it was more common to litigate in those days than it is now. Now it's more mediate.
Yes.
And so people don't go to court because courts don't like interfering too much with sporting organisations.
Yes. And what do you think about that, Murray? What do you think about the shift from litigation and more into mediation that's occurred these days?
Look, I think it's good. I think it's good because it means that it's quicker. It should mean it's cheaper. It should mean it's more accessible. And it should mean that you get a result before, obviously, the season starts. And that's terribly, terribly important, particularly to elite sportsmen.
Yes.
Yeah, very important for women and men.
Yeah. And there's something that I have as a burning question for you, Murray, and I would also think that people watching this video would really appreciate hearing this from you, because you've got the famous smell test that you once explained to me. So what's that all about?
Well, look, that really applies to any ethical question that arises during the course of practice, and it's often very difficult for practitioners to know whether they're doing something right or wrong. And so my argument is that intuitively most lawyers know that something's unethical because it doesn't pass the smell test. And it usually, not always, but usually, if it doesn't pass the smell test, chances are it's wrong.
Yes.
And it's a breach of ethics.
Yes.
And so the intuitive response is often the best.
Yes.
Because it's the feeling you have. There might be a conflict of interest, there might be a breach of confidence, it doesn't matter what it is. Usually the solicitor will know, or the lawyer will know, that this is just simply wrong.
Yes.
And that, if you like, intuitive feeling, that smell test feeling, is usually the correct one.
Yes, and I think it is a great test to use as a lawyer wanting to ensure you're complying with your legal and professional obligations, particularly when the legislation under the uniform law is so detailed and there's many pages. No one really knows every single section. But with the application of the smell test, it's a really good way of gauging whether what you're doing is the right thing to do.
Yeah, and a lot of times lawyers don't have partners they can consult, or they don't have people around them who they can just pick up a phone and say, look, what do you think? But mostly, certainly the Law Institute's one avenue, and a very important avenue for a lot of solicitors in the state of Victoria. It's the same in New South Wales and other states and territories. But it just seems to me that ultimately what lawyers need is good, sound advice from experienced practitioners.
Yes.
And that's always available.
And you've had a fair bit to do with ethics in the legal profession.
Yes, well, I sat on the Ethics Committee of the Victorian Bar for 4 years, and as a lawyer before that, and certainly as a judge, I must say ethical matters arise more often than you might think, but on the other hand, they shouldn't be a hurdle, they just should be something that you acknowledge and understand rather than be a barrier. And once you understand it, you're fine.
Yes. And what would you say in response to the general public perception about the legal profession being unethical, unfair, and lawyers not being good people? What's your view on that?
Well, look, I think ultimately, from the word go, lawyers have to be fit and proper people to practice. And I don't know of any other profession where there's an ongoing duty to comply with ethical standards. And there's also a lot of work done by lawyers that never ever reaches the media, and that's work done on a pro bono free basis. So there's a lot of that done, and no other profession that I know of does that. So lawyers, in a sense, are their own worst enemy because they have bad publicity, but on the other hand, from my experience, they behave in a very honourable and clear way. The problem, of course, is that there's always a tension between operating a profession and operating a business, and so there's that tension. But ultimately, it's the professional obligations that prevail.
Yes. And also, you could even say that most lawyers are very ethical, and sometimes there's not enough credit given to the level of ethics that lawyers employ.
It's like anything. We only hear the bad news. You only hear about the people who deviate from the norm. The norm is that by far most, the majority of lawyers behave ethically, and then you'll hear in the newspaper, it's like crime. You only hear about people who commit crime. You don't hear about the law-abiding citizens who make up over 90% of the population. It's the same with lawyers.
Yes. In your time at the bench of the federal court, you would have made a lot of important decisions.
Well, you like to think they're important, but the basic rule is to give people a fair go. And I only delivered about 800 judgments, but I've got to say, in that time, what you try to do is to be fair and to hear the argument and then make a decision. People like to have an independent judicial decision. If they've got a conflict, it may not be the right decision. That's why you have appeal courts, right up to the High Court. But at the end of the day, you do your best, and you always try and treat people the way you want to be treated yourself. So it's with respect, and you hear the argument and you be fair.
Yes.
That's that simple.
Yeah, fantastic. So in terms of fairness in decision making and also in exercising proper judgment, is there any tips you have to share?
Look, I think you have to understand all the cases before you. I think preparation's terribly, terribly important, but I also think you need to have a good grasp of the law and the facts, and then you give people the opportunity to argue and make submissions. So the tip would be prepared.
Yes.
And that's the fundamental thing, whether you're a lawyer, a judge, I don't care what it is, you have to be prepared.
Yes. Again, I think it comes down to doing the work that's needed, putting in the hard yards as required, particularly as it grows closer to crunch time, trial, for example, and working hard to make sure that proper preparation and proper strategy, as well as proper understanding of the law and facts, are all implemented at a trial, say.
Well, that's right. I mean, the lawyers have a more difficult task in a sense. There's always the duty to the client, but on the other hand, if you discharge that duty correctly, then you anticipate what the other side might say. You don't always think you're right and they're wrong. You have to look at what they are going to say and meet that argument, and you meet that argument best with facts and law. But sometimes the argument against you might be very overwhelming, and the best thing you can do is say to the client, well, look, this is not a great case, and people don't like that, but on the other hand, you're doing your job.
Yes.
If you tell them.
Yes, and you also mentioned, we've mentioned a few key points about ethical obligations of lawyers. Lawyers also have the paramount duty to the court.
Absolutely.
What's that about?
Well, when people start, and oftentimes lawyers don't quite get it, but certainly clients don't understand, a lawyer is an officer of the court. And so as an officer of the court, there's a high duty to the court not to mislead the court, not to fail to mention an authority which might even be against you, not to mention facts or documents that might exist which might not help your case. So the duty to the court is paramount, and that's because all lawyers are, from the beginning, officers of the court. And that's first and foremost.
Yes.
So that's the duty.
And that's a really important and key component to ensure our legal system's functioning properly, isn't it?
Well, it's so fundamental to the administration of justice, and it's something we should cherish.
Yes.
And we should cherish the rule of law, fair go, all those sorts of things. But at the end of the day, the administration of justice depends on the officers of the court doing the right thing.
That's fantastic. I think you've given some great tips, and I've really enjoyed listening, not only to everything that you've shared with me in the past, but also I've enjoyed listening to your answers to these questions today.
Pleasure.
Murray, one final question before we go. For a budding young lawyer out there wanting to do the best they possibly can in their career, just say they've just graduated law school, landed their first job, what's a piece of advice to help such a young lawyer in their career?
Well, look, there's nothing short of hard work, because it won't always get you a result in terms of remuneration. It won't always get you a result in terms of success of the business you're trying to run. But if you work hard and keep working hard and take every opportunity you can to meet people, to talk to people, these days use social media to the maximum, all those things are important, but at the end of the day, it's simple. It's hard work.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Murray.
Okay, thank you.